all that I've heard, next year is going to be even bigger in this regard. Absolutely. I mean, a lot of what's been happening in 2023, it's only setting the stage for what's going to be happening in 2024. NASA's been lying to us, right? A lot of these programs have been lying to us. Moultrie and Bray, that didn't seem honest. People, again, leaning on the Soul thing, like the Soul Foundation, I didn't hear a single person speaking about Arrow with any kind of sense of respect or seriousness. It wasn't even a factor. Now, if you thought that was like a legitimate situation, don't you think that somebody would have brought it up in a more serious manner? They didn't. Nobody did, because it's not. It's just PR. It's like a public-facing element, and I'm glad that it's been basically outed as such. I mean, that's my personal opinion, and like I don't pretend to be like some, like I can see everything in the world, but I don't think you have to see much to understand that there's a reason probably why Sean Kirkpatrick, got his plum gig over at Oak Ridge or whatever, right? That it's like, okay, you did your year, now come and hide. Well, the truth comes out.
All right, Jay. So you were at the Soul Foundation symposium. I think it was 2 days, November 17th and 18th, maybe. Maybe you could go into what that experience was like for you, and what it means for where we're headed. How important was it, and how much significance did this event hold with the disclosure process that's currently unfolding?
Gosh, it's like a 4-part question, Ryan. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me. I know you don't do a whole lot of interviews, so I appreciate you bringing me on. Yeah, it was amazing to be out there in Palo Alto. It's been a long time since I've been in Palo Alto in general, and so it was cool to be there. It was cool to be on Stanford campus again. It did feel very historic just on kind of a basic level to be at an event, invited to an event that was about UAP issues and that was presented by the Stanford School of Medicine. I mean, even just that feels like a win. And it's the kind of thing where it's like, the news within this field has been moving so rapidly. And it just feels like a giant avalanche within the last few months, and maybe especially the last few weeks, the last few days, the last few hours. And so, along those lines, I think it's important to just remember that, like, it seems like just 6 weeks ago, we were patting ourselves on the back for having the first UAP conference at an institution like Stanford, right? And so I think contextually there's that kind of historical fact, which feels very cool. It felt very cool. It was great to be there, kind of walk in and be like, in terms of like arriving the night before, kind of meeting up with a few people that I know in the space, and then walking in that day. I walked over from kind of downtown Palo Alto to the venue. It's like a 35-minute walk, and just like the most beautiful weather, and feeling like this extraordinary sense of potential with what was with what I was anticipating, with what some of the other people I was walking over there with were anticipating. This guy Warren, and Kelly Chase, we were walking over there together. Kelly Chase of the UFO Rabbit Hole podcast, and then you walk in the door, and one of the first people that I saw there was Russell Targ, and I look around, and there's just all these wonderful faces, these historic people in the field. Seeing Jacques, kind of up ahead, seeing Chris Mellon up ahead. There's this kind of a big line of people waiting to check in. There was like a fair amount of security there, and so they were checking names and invites and things like that, handing us badges. But I think just walking in that day, I was coming in feeling like a sense of optimism, a sense that there was something historic happening, and that was borne out even the night before. The night before, I was hanging out a bit with Micah Hanks from the Debrief, and Chrissy Newton and some other folks, and there was this kind of element of just like staring at our hands and being like, wow, look at this, look at what's happening here. So I'll pause there for a second and just say, like, yeah, let you maybe restate if there's anything that you'd like to kind of like steer me in the right direction. But, do I think that that this conference was pivotal in terms of what I'm seeing unfold in terms of the disclosure process? Absolutely. Absolutely. To like a stunning and kind of shocking degree, in all the ways. I'm still honestly trying to process everything that happened at the conference itself and the conversations around the conference, the activity around the conference. I'm still trying to kind of wrap my head around everything that happened there. And I'm recognizing the seriousness of it. Not like the seriousness of the presentations, how seriously people were taking it. This is not a joke. Like, none of this was a joke. And people were taking this like very seriously. You could even say like deadly seriously in some situations. I know to a lot of people with that kind of casually look in on these things, there is the sense that this seems like one of the most important questions that we could have in human history. Are we alone? We're not, and like what that implies about the nature of our reality, what that implies about our history, the nature of our species, all these questions, right? And there are a lot of people within the field, I think, that pay attention to ufology and anomalous studies in general as a form of entertainment. They view it as a form of entertainment. And it's important to recognize that for some people, there are much higher stakes when it comes to this field. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think like the bunkers probably more than anyone see it as a form of entertainment. They don't believe there's any substance to it. And yet some of them spend large portions of their time immersed in this topic and just trying to own people who are actually taking it seriously, which I think at this point is kind of silly. I mean, just looking at the roster, the people that were at the symposium you attended is pretty off the charts. And I recollect that Dr. Gary Nolan recently said that he was surprised how many Stanford professors were in attendance at the Soul Foundation UFO Symposium. I want to touch on something you touched on, which is the avalanche that we've seen in the past couple of weeks of the media. David Grush has been on the Joe Rogan Experience. I think it was yesterday that Tucker Carlson had Representative Burchett on, and they talked about the UFO cover-up and how absurd it is. And recently, a couple journalists broke the story on the OGA, the Office Global Access, which is in the Science and Technology Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency, allegedly. Although I will say that both Jeremy Corbell and journalist Ross Coulthart vouched for the veracity of this office that is within the CIA and allegedly it coordinates some recoveries of crashed UFOs that are not of human origin, even though they coordinate recoveries of other stuff too, like satellites and nuclear hardware and adversarial technologies. But what I wanted to ask you is, what do you think about the current state of the Disclosure Act within the Schumer rounds legislation? Because it's been reported that there's been some pushback by key members of the Republican leadership of the Congress. And I'm thinking, like, why are you pushing back? Because this avalanche that you pointed out, it's not going anywhere. You can push back against the legislation all you want, but like, to me, if this legislation doesn't get passed intact, it's going to make potentially very dangerous leaks more likely, because people from the inside are just going to get fed up and they're going to just start leaking stuff themselves. What's your take on what's going on with that?
I think that's a very perceptive point, Ryan. And I miss seeing your face, by the way. I miss seeing your face. But I think there we go. Hey,
I haven't. I haven't done an interview in a long time, and Jay is looking so handsome right now. I just thought I'd give him more airtime. But anyways, go ahead, Jay.
Hey, man. No, like people want to see. Look at this face. This is the face people tune into Post-Disclosure World for. It's right here in front of me. I see it. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't think that it takes a rocket scientist to figure out why Mike Turner might not want the Schumer Act to get passed, and who might be kind of pulling the strings in a situation like that with Rounds and other people like that. I mean, a challenge there is that defense contractors, fund political campaigns all the time, and there are people that are more well funded by that or feel more beholden to that than other people. And of course, some people, their district happens to be where Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is, or other facilities that have been, part of the lore of anomalous studies, ufology, even the potential of crash retrievals for quite some time. So along those lines, I'm not surprised that the Schumer Act, the Schumer Amendment, that was in danger, and that it probably is, that it's still in a kind of a precarious position, seemingly. I think it's interesting that it looked like it was about to be shot down entirely, and then magically out of nowhere, Matt Ford and Chris Sharp and others, got out that OGA article that, according to people that I've heard from as well, there seems to be there seems to be a real link there. It seems to be a very legit link in terms of OGA and some of these crash retrievals. Probably not all of them, but some of them. Now, so I think it's kind of amazing that it was kind of like, oh, it's dead in the water, Schumer, it's dead, it's not happening. This OGA article comes out, and then all of a sudden, it's like a rainbow came out, and it's like, actually, maybe the Schumer is going to work out, and so, I mean, it's clear to anybody watching that, the shots have been fired in multiple directions in the last couple of weeks, right? Especially just these last few days, maybe especially the last 2 days, like a lot has kind of, it's as if, that's another thing. And when I was talking earlier about kind of like the severity and the seriousness with which some people, that are closer to the actual situation, the seriousness with which they have to take things is that, some people do think of this as entertainment, and some people think of this as kind of like an academic or philosophical exercise. I enjoy kind of thinking from a social sciences perspective myself. And of course, my perspective on it is largely based around, the experiences of people that have had interactions and their own anomalous experiences themselves, right? The psychology of that, where that's coming from, that's kind of more what I enjoy thinking about. And I have studiously avoided, in many ways, looking into classified stuff, propulsion, energy fields, like a lot of the stuff from the DIRDs, not because they're not fascinating. I've read most of them, but I don't pursue that stuff because it tends to be dangerous to people's health. And that's like a legit thing, and like some people, they don't recognize that, so along those lines, I saw there, and I have seen that it can be exciting to watch from the sidelines, but it can also be chilling to recognize that essentially what we're looking at, this whole field of ufology has been living on the sidelines of a Cold War of defense contractors and various factions of the intelligence community for decades. And we're, in many ways, it's by the grace of God and a strong sense of benevolence that many of us are kind of like okay sitting around on these sidelines while this Cold War is going on, because parking up on the border of Russia and Ukraine, that's not going to be good for people's health, right? Well, this situation could be a little bit similarly. So it's to say that it's as if there's been a long game of Uno a long game of bridge that's been going on for 70, 80 years. People have all these cards in their hands. You know, when you play Uno and your grandma has like 80 cards in her hands and you're like, grandma's never going to win. And somehow she pulls out a win at the last minute, just somehow through all that experience that she has. It like here we see a situation where within the last few days, it feels like cards are finally getting played that have been long held, that have been held in people's hands this whole game.
Regarding your focus of the topic, maybe you could share a little bit, and the pronunciation on this might be a little off because I think you made this word up. But your production company is called Ontocalypse Productions, and you are directing a 3-part docuseries titled "The Beyond: UFOs in a New Reality." How do you intend to approach directing this 3-part docuseries, and what is it going to compose of?
Great. Thanks so much for asking that. Yeah, it's the word. Actually, Kelly Chase made up the word. It's pronounced ontocalypse, and it started out like a lot of good ideas. It started out as a joke that got serious, and so it's a combination of ontology and apocalypse, and we all thought it was kind of silly, and we kind of liked it, and we were joking around about it. And then Jeff Kripal said he liked it. And when Jeff Kripal says he likes anything, you got to kind of take it a little bit more seriously. And then we're like, maybe there's something to that. But basically what happened is that there's this guy, Jordan, who's friends with Kelly and I. He's been coming to our Inquire Anomalous conferences in New York for a while. He's kind of a New York guy. He lives up in Connecticut. And he went to business school, and he has a lot of experience in terms of like money management, financial stuff. And he's a great guy, Jordan Flowers. And we were having conversations, Kelly, him, me, a few other people, around how, like, what does anomalous study? What does ufology? What does this field, looking into the future, what does it need? What does it need? And Jordan doesn't believe that the field needs less money, right? And because for a bunch of different reasons, right? As Avi Loeb put it, like, extraordinary claims require extraordinary funding. And I think that there's something to that. And if you're going to try to get a decent message out to people, you have to figure out the best and most effective way you can do it. And it just so happens that I have a history in television. I primarily used to work as a TV producer, mainly for like Discovery Channel shows and stuff that Discovery owned, shows for like Animal Planet, TLC, Discovery itself, things like that. And primarily I worked on nonfiction shows, like action shows, travel shows, food shows, but shows that were based around like an interview room. And so I realized, like, oh gosh, this is a great opportunity. Kelly Chase with her UFO rabbit hole has been like writing the living out of her episodes. She does a great job putting together, an hour of kind of clearly written thought just about every week. She's not just kind of flying by the seat of her pants. She's really putting in some effort there. And it's been great effort. And I recognize that, here's this opportunity with somebody that has a great amount of experience raising money, Jordan. And what do you need to make a TV show independently so that nobody's trying to tell you what to say? You need money, And so we decided that we could make an independently funded docuseries and be able to put it out there and be able to say exactly what we wanted to say. And so that's what we're going to do. And we started shooting for it while out in Palo Alto. So we recorded out there with Jeff Kripal and Whitley Strieber and Greg Bishop, who of course wrote Project Beta on disinformation, and Richard Doty and Paul Benowitz, etc. And we also talked to Dr. E.O. Whiteley, a space psychologist, who has some really amazing things that she can say, and probably some more amazing things that she can't say about what astronauts have dealt with out there in space and the issues that they face when they come back from space. Diana Pasulka wrote about her in her new book, Encounters, and it was kind of fascinating to hear from her in the interview room that'll be on the show. about what that really entails. We're going to talk to her again before we finish shooting. But basically, we're going to be shooting with prominent folks in the community. And to answer your question in a long-winded way, what we're really looking to do with the show is basically start where other shows end. Most of the shows in this space that are really grounded and well-informed are kind of taking the central premise that, like, we need to prove the case. We have to prove the case. We're going to take these 5 episodes or whatever, 6 episodes, 8 episodes, whatever it is, and we're going to try to lay out the facts as best as we can see them, lay out the receipts, and try to prove the case. And then there are ungrounded shows that just kind of like say, well, maybe that was aliens. Well, maybe this was aliens. Well, maybe that was aliens over here. And they have the advantage, though being ungrounded, in being able to kind of take it as a given that there's a fundamental truth to this. And so kind of the germinating seed for me was thinking like, well, okay, how many people hate watch UFO shows? And how many people really need to be convinced that there's a there if they're already watching, if they're already 3 episodes deep into a UFO show or an anomalous study show? And so we're going to start where a lot of UFO shows end. And we're going to assume that there's a fundamental reality to this, so we can talk to grounded experts in the field and kind of unshackle them so that they can get to the deeper thoughts about the implications for reality and the wider kind of network of high strangeness and what actually happens and what are the issues within this field that people have been editing out for years because they're kind of inconvenient. And like, how did we get to a point in our culture where, we thought we were living in this future, but we didn't acknowledge this thing that people have been seeing for thousands of years? So we're gonna kind of swing for the fences, but I'm optimistic about how it's gonna go.
What is your thought on the idea that once we get UFO confirmation, where there's no longer debate, that it could change, that it could influence how the phenomenon itself behaves? In other words, in our current environment, and as it has been for decades, our great institutions are in some respects are antagonistic or even hostile toward the proposition that we are not alone and we're being engaged by non-human intelligence. It's not taught in our schools or our universities. The media barely covers it. Now, this is beginning to shift, of course, and we are, in my opinion, heading into what I like to call a post-disclosure world. Do you think that once this becomes a scientific given that, hey, we're not alone, we're not on the highest manifestation of the food chain, and there's something else out there that's bigger, better, smarter, more strategic, more technologically advanced than us, could that be a signal to the phenomenon and shift its behavior? And should that be a concern when it comes to whether or not we should actually open up the books and let the public know what's really going on with our reality?
I think that's a great question, Ryan. I think that's an absolutely great question. I think that it's very possible or even likely that some of the non-human intelligence, the phenomenon, however you'd like to frame it, that some of this activity and some of this intelligence will probably behave differently as it becomes more accepted in a way in our culture, in Western consensus culture, that is. It's important to recognize that in some world cultures, there's never been a schism, and it's always been, okay to think about, the star people or things like that. And it can be humbling to recognize that, that in Western consensus culture, we often think of ourselves as kind of, the most advanced things have ever gotten. But, some of these ancient traditions and some of these older traditions that have more of a through line have been able to kind of like hold this as a truth for longer and more consistently than we have. Along those lines, it's important to look at the work of people like R.D. Six Killer Clark and others that really look at kind of alternative cosmologies in terms of how does the phenomenon behave when it's accepted as a truth? Or it's accepted that it's just kind of part of nature in a way. And it seems to hide less when it's accepted. But it's also important to recognize that we have cognitive filters for ourselves. And I think that, the human brain has an amazing capacity to hit the recycle button when it sees things that it doesn't understand. And so there's a co-creative quality to this where it will probably hide less. They will probably hide less. Various, kind of more hidden intelligences will probably hide less in the future as more of this is known. And similarly, people will know what to look out for more, or will be hindered less by having seen it. Hindered less in terms of their cognitive facilities themselves even might be hindered less. So it's not just an inconvenient truth that people kind of shy away from. But I think that there's, on some basic level, kind of like what people like Don Hoffman talk about in Case Against Reality and books like that as we acclimate ourselves to a new form of nature, that our sensing itself may even evolve and change.
So in practical terms, what do you think this would actually look like when you say that the phenomenon may hide less once it's no longer filled with a stigma, and it's scientifically accepted that we're just not alone? What do you think that looks like in your opinion?
Well, I mean, it might look a little bit like what Jacques Vallée wrote about in Passport to Magonia, or it might be like what people like Joshua Cutchin, who's kind of a comparative mythologist and historian. He's going to be talking at our next conference in a few weeks. But he wrote this great book called Ecology of Souls, A New Mythology of Death and the Paranormal. This is volume 2. Now, it's almost a shame in some ways. It's a great title. It's an appropriate title, but it's a shame for a lot of people in the ufology realm that's talking about souls or mythology or death and the paranormal, that's going to be way, way, way too much in the woo for them to be dealing with. But if I look at the table of contents here, we're looking at ufology in the overworld, alien abductions, star shamans, aliens and the dead, the soulcraft of UFOs, aliens as the other, aliens as ourselves. He's really doing a great job of kind of like looking at the history of what people have observed in different world cultures and really overlaying it in terms of like let's look at what has been happening recently in anomalous studies, and how have we been framing it? How has this stuff been framed in the past? And is there a kind of middle area that might be more accurate? And so along those lines, when we talk about like what could be happening in the future, we could actually look towards the past in cultures where this has been more popularly accepted. And it could turn out to be as was characterized in like fairy folklore and in Passport to Magonia and Ecology of Souls as this kind of aspect of nature that often hides out at the edge of town or deep in the woods. I'm not entirely certain, but I think that it's possible that people would be communing with that a bit more often, and then it'd be more willing to show itself. And if that's the case, I can understand why people would be scared. I can understand why people in positions of power would be scared. It would be a fundamental shift. It's more profound. It's much more profound than just kind of reading about it in the newspaper or seeing some grainy video or something like that. When you can conceptualize that maybe this reality and this topic would hit people on a more personal level, on a more universal framework.
Yeah, and it seems to me, I mean, obviously I'm speculating here because I can't read the mind of the phenomenon, nor do I have like an open telephone number that I can reach them at.
Me neither, yeah.
Maybe a good thing. I don't know if I want that, but it seems to me that if you look at the historical record, this phenomenon, I use phenomenon singular, but I'm not referring to one phenomenon. There's a certain someone that always gives me issues about that, bizarrely. But this phenomenon, it seems like it has been. It's like this balancing act that it's been employing, where it wants to make itself it wants to make it as obvious as possible within society that it's real, but it also simultaneously wants to prevent it from the evidence being so scientific and tangible and high fidelity that our institutions can deny it. Now, why it would implement its behavior to create that kind of outcome, I can only speculate. But it seems to me that it wouldn't do this indefinitely, because it has to know that you can only do that so long, particularly if it's true that they're crashing, they're sometimes landing, and then these aerospace companies will go to where they landed. Sometimes there's dead bodies, apparently. Sometimes they're been abandoned, which is kind of spooky. Where the hell did they go? Do they, you know what I'm saying? Do they go to some fast food joint or something before they get out of town? What are they doing?
They got lost on the way back.
It's almost theatrical when you think about it. When you think about the crashes, the landings, sometimes these craft land, there's nothing there. Like, it's almost like they're putting on a show, and they're kind of playing with the national security apparatus of multiple countries. I've been very suspicious for a long time now that they've baited governments into a cover-up. Do they have the technology to completely conceal themselves from our satellites, from our radars? I think they might have that capabilities. I don't know. But obviously, and also there have been reports that there's actually been excavations, right, where they've been in the soil, if you will, for maybe thousands of years, and they probably knew that, like, eventually civilization was going to find them. I know that Bob Lazar, and I don't really have an opinion on Bob Lazar, I'm agnostic, but I know that he said that when he was working in the program that he kind of came across conversations about that. Some of them were excavated, and even recently, David Grush kind of hinted to that in a very explicit way when he was on the Joe Rogan show. He's like, they go way back kind of thing, but I can't give you specifics. Like, so way back, even prior to the 1930s with the alleged crash in Italy. So I feel like we're being played. I feel like there's some kind of a script here. Are they using some kind of advanced artificial intelligence, knowing that I'll do X and therefore Y will happen, or is it more random than that? My bias is they're using artificial intelligence, because I've reflected on this, and I've thought, if you were thousands of years, let's say, ahead of the civilization you're tinkering with, would you just be random? Would you just be like, lick your finger and put it in the sky and say, I'm going to do X and see what happens? Or would you take it much more seriously and harness your best technology? So it seems like they have a plan to influence our civilization. And to me, this is not all random, the crashes, the landings. There might be some random aspects, right? Because I think they're engaging an abduction. So two things can be true at the same time, right? They're doing something to influence us into a certain trajectory, but they also have their own, if you will, selfish desires. They want to tinker with us. They want to study us. So, it's not all like this counterintelligence or influence game they're playing. I'm sure a lot of different things are happening at the same time. But I kind of went off on a tangent. But I want to ask you about Colonel Carl Nell, because he was one of the most, if not the most anticipated speaker at the symposium. He talks about a controlled disclosure versus a catastrophic disclosure. And and I think he cited, with the controlled disclosure, we're going to try to get this done by 2034. Now, understandably, a lot of people who have been pushing for transparency think to themselves, wait a minute, we're going to have to wait 10 years for the U.S. government to truly and completely come clean on this, which, by the way, I don't even think is possible. There's no way. I don't think we can go another 10 years without this coming out. But what's your whatever, however you want to treat whatever I just said, go for it.
Sure. Well, there are a few things in order, and I'd like to come back to a few of them. I think, first off, yes, Jacques Vallée's old hypothesis of the control mechanism hypothesis with regard to non-human intelligence, at least some of the non-human intelligence that seems that is kind of living alongside of us or visiting alongside of us. I think that there is an element of that. I think it's important to recognize, as you're saying, like, I think that AI could be a significant part of that. I've heard from various folks that as we've talked about, as you and I have talked about, with regard to abductions and situations like that, what could be one shocking thing on kind of a scale of 1 to 10 with regard to this phenomenon? What if all those abductees that reported these grays, these bulbous-headed beings that are about often between 3 and 4 foot tall, sometimes a little bit taller, what if some of those recovered biologics that David Grush talked about, what if they exactly match? What if they exactly match what so many of these abductees have been reporting for many, many years? There's going to be something to that. And along those lines, though, there has been a lot of speculation, and I've heard from some like pretty high-placed sources that there is very high-level informed speculation that at least some of those grays, if not most of them, are in themselves a form of artificial intelligence. And there seems to be something to that. I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it at all. I think that there's something behind the grays that might be doing this. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's possible. I'm not going to say 100%. As you know, like, I don't pretend to know everything with regard to this field. I don't pretend to have all the answers. I certainly don't. But in terms of like non-human intelligence and AI, it does make a lot of sense. It does make a lot of sense that if you were seeing these kind of like dangerous monkeys that kind of like rode on the back of rockets everywhere and things like that, that you might not send your best people to go interact with them. You might not send people at all, right? And then along those lines, you also brought up Carl Nell. I met Carl Nell that morning, the morning of his presentation. It got on the way from kind of like the hotel area to the facility that the symposium was being held at. He's a very nice guy. He's a very interesting guy. And I think that there's been, with that leaked slide and things like that, I think that there's been a lot, even with the slide, there's been a lot of kind of misinformation about what Carl's presentation actually was. First of all, I think that, and this is not to say that, like, I think that things should wait until 2034. I don't think that any of this should be waited on at all. But I do want to say that, like, I think that, the uncontrolled disclosure, I want to be careful because, like, Gary and Peter, they had some rules for the symposium. And so, I'm still kind of waiting on how specifically I can talk about stuff until some of those videos come out, until I know what has been kind of approved by each of the speakers to release. But I do think, as some other people online have stated, and I'll be pointing more towards those folks, that when Carl Nell was talking about uncontrolled disclosure, he was speaking specifically if the disclosure came out from the phenomenon itself, from some of this non-human intelligence itself in an uncontrolled, chaotic way, or if this happened from the perspective of some of our some of the U.S. government's adversaries. I don't think of anybody specifically in China or Russia as my personal adversary, but some of these world governments tend to think of each other as adversaries, right? And so he was referring specifically with this kind of like chaotic, catastrophic disclosure. He was talking about reveals by the intelligence itself and by adversaries. So I think it's important to recognize that, because that's an important level to think at. Like, what if it did happen, as you're kind of hinting at earlier, from non-human intelligence itself? But then with regard to 2034, the 2034 thing, it was more about, like, when is this all wrapped up and done? It wasn't like the first card would be played in 10 years. What I took from that presentation, and what I took in general from what people were presenting that day to observe Chatham House rules, that it was a process by which there would be like a full acclamation in terms of like the public conversation and things like that. And so, there were little windows about like, when do we think that academia is fully going to be like, okay, you guys were right, fine, they're real, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a little bit more about like kind of a strategy for a full society acceptance rather than like just pushing the ball downfield. That was my understanding anyway. And I thought Carl Nell seemed like a very well-intentioned person. I thought that, with the respect that people like Dave Grush put towards Carl Nell, with the amount of respect that people like Gary and others put towards Carl Nell, I think that he's a thoughtful person, and he in his own way, in whatever he's doing, I think that he's trying to, there's a sense of sobriety to the conversation that really pervaded around then, in terms of like, how do we do this responsibly? And I think that, it was a bit of a punch to the gut for a lot of people to really kind of stew on that. And, but that's not to say that it's not going to happen, or that it shouldn't happen, because this stuff is going to get revealed one way or the other. And like, as you probably know, I don't trust DC to get anything done. I don't trust DC to get a damn thing done. Ever. I went down for the House UAP hearing, like the building's great, it looks really nice. I met Tim Burchett, and I met Jamie Raskin, and I met some other folks around there. I met some of the politicians. I met Jared, and it was amazing to feel like, not necessarily participating, but being on the sidelines of this historic event. And at the same time, I recognize, I'm a registered voter. I go and vote. Do I think that these people really help us? Nah, not always. Do I think that they tell the truth? Absolutely not. Do I think they get funded by all sorts of terrible corporations? And yeah, absolutely. Of course I do. And so, to me, it's always been like, we need, and I think part of what this race is with disclosure and these initiatives is that the secrecy is going to get outpaced by advances in technology. And it's going to get outpaced by advances in academic acceptance, in terms of like startups, in terms of the public conversation, and in terms of like what the consumer has in their toolkit for being able to detect and sense the world around them. So I think that that's part of the big race. Part of the big race is that people are going to be able to reclaim their own agency in this situation, and are going to be able to push the ball forward, as we as kind of a community have been doing. That we're going to be aided by kind of like the social change that's been happening with regard to this field. And that's, I think, more what some people are scared of, that they're going to be eclipsed and outpaced by us reclaiming our agency and finding out more of the truth ourselves.
You said in an interview that you were a part of that you spoke to some people in the know, and they said that there's no plan to broach abductions. And I think you said that you weren't, let's put it lightly, you weren't a big fan of that. And I find that interesting, because I think even within ufology, there's a certain segment of ufology that doesn't really like to talk too much about abductions because it's weird. And then, it gets even weirder, because a lot of people who even just have an encounter with a UAP, not even a face-to-face encounter with any of the entities, later they'll have like weird circumstances happen to them, like poltergeist activity. So there seems to be associated phenomenon, even with just merely seeing the object in the sky, which is really strange. So the depth of weirdness that surrounds this has a lot more texture than some people within ufology really want to highlight. And ultimately, I mean, I think we're going to have to accept how absolutely bizarre this is. And part of it is like, well, eventually, whistleblowers are going to be start talking about what the creatures look like. That's going to happen. Now, Grush, He did say that I don't remember what word he used, but it basically suggests that yes, some of the entities look different from others. He did not go into what the entities look like, but that's eventually going to happen. And the moment that happens, anyone worth their salt is going to say, oh my God. So these people that have been claiming they've been abducted, they've been witnessing the very same looking creatures as they're finding with these downed or landed craft. So do you think the government's going to have to start broaching the abduction phenomenon, or do you think they're just going to play stupid as long as they can?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thanks for posing it, Ryan. I mean, obviously, for obvious reasons, this is an issue that's very close to my heart and very close to my personal experience. And first of all, I want to point out, without broaching confidentiality, abductions were taken seriously at the Soul Foundation Symposium. They were brought up. It was brought up by 3 or 4 of the speakers, as I recall, and people weren't laughing. It was very serious. They weren't brought up as a joke. It was more about like, how are we going to integrate this into the conversation? How is this going to be accounted for? And I will say, without mentioning who this person is, but a very senior figure in our field, a very senior figure. It's always an honor to see this person walk in the door. I think one of the interesting things that will come out in the next weeks is, this person had a critical view of the Schumer, and it caused a stir. It caused a big stir, and without kind of getting into the particulars, can't mention the person's name, but one of the points that they brought up was that how does the Schumer account for the abductees, and that there was a sense that it wasn't just about like, oh, the poor abductees, but like, where is the liability here? What's the liability? Who has the liability? Like, who has the fault here? Like, where's the responsibility for this? I think that was part of what was hinted there. And, I'm not going to speak for that person. I don't have the capacity to. But I will say that I'm surprised that I'm kind of happily surprised, but also kind of shocked that more people haven't brought that moment up. But there are other people that were talking about this. Now, to bring this to a kind of a larger point, I worry, I worry about how that's going to get framed in the future. However, I do recognize that I was recently in a room with, over 200 of the more significant people that really the thought leaders in this field. And that topic was taken gravely seriously. So, I think that one of the aspects here is that within the field, within the community of ufology, within kind of like on the online conversation, that it's important, I think, for myself, partially for my sanity, but that we can stop having a no child left behind policy with regard to this stuff. If people don't want to take abduction seriously, I know that many of the most important thought leaders in the space do take it seriously. So you know what? I don't have to take those people seriously. I don't have to drag, corpses around, trying to like bring some like somnambulant zombie into some of these truths. I don't necessarily need to engage with debunkers. I don't need to engage with other folks that way. And I think that it's going to be, and I think that many other people in this community are going to be shocked that they've been directly adjacent to people that have been talking about this for a very long time, and that perhaps they've been incredibly callous, even just in thinking like, oh, that's something that I'll think about later. That's something that I'll deal with later. I'll deal with that later when it's real. Well, it's been real the whole time. And as a society, how's that going to be handled? I'm not entirely sure. Because it's important to recognize that back in the 90s, this was like all over popular culture, starting back in the 70s with like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and then forward, through Even Flight of the Navigator, like Disney put out a movie that kind of hinted at some of this stuff, like, and it's important to remember that came out right around when Whitley Strieber was publishing Communion. This was definitely has been in the public consciousness for quite some time. And so it's probably good that it has been. It's certainly good that it has been, because there has been a process of acclimation. And I think it's definitely one of many kind of subfields within this topic that's going to shock people, and that there's going to be a lot of reckoning happening for sure.
I mean, to me, it's one of the most, I think Grant Cameron sometimes talks about this as like, who cares about the craft? It's about the aliens themselves. And there's a lot of truth to that. And I think like in a post-disclosure world, it's like one of the biggest scientific mysteries is, why are they abducting people? How many people are they abducting? What are they trying to accomplish? How frequent is this? I mean, this is some of the most fundamental questions you can ask once we get confirmation this is real. And I'm sure the UFO programs that are classified understand, they're not oblivious to the fact that this is one of the most important questions civilization is going to have. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if there are programs right now going on that focus on the question of abductions, potentially, maybe for, just so they can figure out agenda. Because maybe if we understood why these abductions are happening, we would solve a big part of the puzzle as to why they're even engaging humanity in the first place, and where do they come from, and all that. Do you think that, because we talked about how they may hide less, the phenomenon may hide less once it's established they're here, do you think that the nature of abductions will change in a post-confirmation world?
It's a great question. I'm not certain. I don't know the answer. I want to start off with that. A lot of what I'm talking about today with regard to non-human intelligence, I don't pretend to know exactly what they're thinking. I don't pretend to know exactly where they come from. I don't pretend to know any of that stuff. Just because I've been adjacent to non-human intelligence, as many of us have, whether we recognize it or not, I'm not entirely certain. However, will the nature of abductions and whatever they're doing that way, will that change? It's possible. It's possible. It's also possible that, along the lines of us talking about artificial intelligence, there's been a lot of speculation from people like Mike Masters and a lot of other folks within terms of like space-time engineering, that it's very possible that some of this non-human intelligence lives outside of our conception of time, that they might live in some aspect of our future, that they might live in some aspect of our past, or that they might live in a different kind of system entirely, as hard as it might be for us to wrap our heads around. But it would help explain why they're so dang good at this gamesmanship with what, the trickster phenomenon. Jeff Kripal talks about it all the time. He's like, you got to look more at the trickster mythology. You have to look more at the trickster and the paranormal. You have to look at that because of this gamesmanship, and because of how we get beat at this game of chess over and over and over and over again. But if you know how the chess game is going to end, and you know how it starts, and then all you have to do is deal with the probability of what happens in between, it starts to make a little bit more sense. I'm not saying that that's necessarily exactly what's happening, and it certainly doesn't explain everything, but there's an aspect of that does tend to kind of track. So as far as like what they're doing, I don't entirely know. It does, some part of it does seem to be based largely around, periodic medical observation. Now, and some of what you were referring to earlier, that somebody could have a sighting in the air and it could like change their dreams, they could have a precognitive vision, that's true. That's absolutely true, that high strangeness aspect, where there's also an aspect where it kind of gets towards what people like Joshua, what people like Diana Pasulka, what people like Jeff Kripal, they'll point out that like how often these encounters look a lot like shamanic initiation. that how often they look like initiatory practices where something reveals itself to you and you get this kind of like, this huge, mind screw in terms of like opening yourself up to something and having maybe like a temporary window to this wider world where you might encounter a precognitive experience, or you might have a strange cluster of what seem to be like synchronicities and things like this, or an out-of-body encounter. That definitely, there is an aspect of that happens very, very frequently as well. And it's important to talk about that as well, because, what we're looking at here is that, yes, there are these situations that people think of abductions that happen. And then there are these other situations where people encounter some form of non-human intelligence, and it becomes like a kind of deeply profound experience that sometimes opens people up to other modalities. And there's, no pun intended, a gray area between those two. And there's probably more as well. Along the lines of what they're actually doing, though, I mean, there seems to be some pull-outs to kind of regularly check on medical situations. It reminds me of how we treat like sea turtles and things like that, right? And I'm not sure if some of those non-human intelligence think that the ends justify the means, and like I don't know, but I do think that people like Mack, like people like Hopkins, even people like Jacobs, I think Jacobs got a lot of his analysis wrong, but he did have some really good raw data in there as well. There are people like Carla Turner. There are a lot of folks that have like really looked at this over the years and have uncovered some really, really uncomfortable truths within the data.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That makes me think about like, for example, if some of the grays, if not all of them, are basically biological robots that maybe are self-aware in some sense, and they're just like kind of like machine slaves of whatever's behind this phenomenon, so that the phenomenon itself, or the civilization, whatever terminology you want to use, doesn't have to like contend with a bunch of angry talking monkeys, which I can understand. The thing about it is, because some people get really emotional about what the phenomenon is, they want their narrative to be the one that's accepted. And maybe even I fell into that trap to some extent. Maybe we've all kind of fell into that trap to some extent, because we're just, we all have egos and all that. But I'm kind of like, I'm done with that. I don't care what it is. It's just so bizarre. It doesn't even make any difference at this point. But what I wanted to get across is like, it's possible that it is a little more mundane than a lot of our fantastical perspectives are, in the sense that it could be coming from other planets, from other star systems. But what happens is, when these civilizations become like, a million years ahead of our civilization, for one thing, we have to contend with they're more evolved, right? So they've gone through hundreds of thousands, millions of years potentially of evolution that we haven't. What does that do to a biological being? Maybe it makes them telepathic. Maybe it makes it so that they're more connected with the other side, if you will. The veil thins for them, because that's part of evolution. We don't know that because we haven't gotten there. So my point is, it may not be entities that actually have such a much weirder origin than we do, right? Maybe like they've evolved from some kind of other subtle sphere. It may not be that. It may be that they're just so much older than we are, and we just have no frame of reference of what happens to biological beings over hundreds of thousands of years, that we're filling in the blanks, that because they're so weird, because there's high strangeness, because they're telepathic and all this, therefore they must be, coming from some kind of other time range, and but maybe that's what happens, right? Maybe that's where we'll be a million years from now. We'll be able to traverse different times and explore different dimensions, and maybe our spirits even will have more of maybe be more in tune with reality in a way we can't even comprehend. The very existence of this phenomenon touches on profound mysteries, and it may not be that they have some kind of strange origin, and it's fun to that's more exciting, but maybe it's just, no, they've just been around longer than we have, and that's what happens to you. You become completely weird. Something to consider.
Well, I am aware that looking around me and some of my old professors and things like that, people tend to get more eccentric as they get older. That does tend to happen, right? Absolutely.
And like maybe the trickster phenomenon. I mean, I'm just throwing things out there. Maybe the trickster phenomenon is to give us an impression of the phenomenon, right? The trickster part of the phenomenon isn't necessarily a sincere expression of it. Maybe it knows exactly what it's doing. Maybe it knows we'll perceive it as bizarre, and it's there to have it to influence us. But it's not like, oh, I'm the phenomenon. I'm being completely sincere, and this is just kind of how we operate. Maybe there's a lot more thought process going into that trickster relationship it has with us. Just throwing that out there to counterbalance the claims like it must be this or it must be that. No, everything's on the table. And look, yes. What you were getting at earlier, that might be true. And by the way, what you said makes a whole lot of sense. I'm just throwing that out there just for fun.
Oh, yeah. I don't think anything should be left off the table, especially because I think that we could be dealing with, a very, very wide range. We could be, it's not just a zoo of different intelligences. It could be like the whole city next to the zoo worth of intelligences. We could be dealing with a lot of different phenomena. We could be dealing with stuff that's essentially like spectral bats, things that are essentially animals. And then other situations where it could be something that's just from, some other planet that happens to be thousands of years ahead of us. There does seem to be something with what people report in terms of like, it seems that there might be some other level of reality that's just next to us somehow, that is almost like a different radio station and I could understand how it would be in the best interest of many forms of other intelligences if they natively lived in some realm that was just off of us, to like figure out ways to be like, nope, don't look over here. Nope, not over here. They get to have that whole, maybe they saw what happened. Maybe they saw the whole Christopher Columbus thing. Maybe they saw all that. And they're like, no, we're not going to, we like where we are. You guys stay over there. We're going to go over here and you guys stay over there. That's possible, right? I think all of that and more, it can and should be on the table. It should absolutely all be on the table, because, the second that we start editing these guesses, the second we start chucking things over our shoulder because it seems too weird, that's when we start to lose sight of like what's actually going on. That's when we lose sight. And that's how, various ufology groups and other paranormal groups in the past started to kind of like lose their way, I think, is when they started to say like, oh, this person, they saw a landed craft, but they said they saw an occupant and it didn't look human. We're just going to throw that off over our shoulder. And then, there's a whole nother wave, a whole nother era where it's like, if somebody had more than one encounter, well, that means that all bets, that person's crazy. That's impossible.
Oh, yeah. They call them, right? Debunkers call those repeaters, right. Not incorporating the idea that maybe the intelligence wants to visit a particular individual multiple times. My good friend Finn, he had 3 encounters with triangles, and he's told me before, like, he doesn't like to tell people that it happened 3 times, because he tells me as soon as you tell people that, then they don't take you seriously anymore, which is absurd, because that assumes so much about something we can't even scratch the surface with. So that's kind of a ridiculous jump of logic that some of these skeptics, debunkers make about this enigma.
Absolutely. Are you talking about Finn 365, the guy that does the recreations? Yeah. His work is great. I love his work. I was actually at Archives of the Impossible earlier in May. Just as a brief aside, I just want to say, Finn 365 Appreciation Fan Club here for just a second. Those recreations are so good. He did a really great one of Gary. He does all, he did one of another friend of mine who maybe I shouldn't mention, but like, I was at a table, and, it was Greg Bishop and Joshua Cutchin and a couple of people who are prominent in the community behind the scenes, but don't like to be out in public. And some of the other speakers that were over there. And Greg was just like, bringing up Finn's work and like showing it around at the table, for like a good hour. Like, people were just looking at them as if, you know, is looking at slideshows, you know, at baby pictures or something like that. It just kept getting passed around the table. People like, damn, that's a good one, you know, yada, yada, yada. And it was really beautiful to see. I think that the guy does great work, and I'm glad to hear that he's got friends like you, because I think that people like that have the kind of, that have talent and generosity, like I was talking about before, with regard to like people reclaiming their own agency and pushing the ball forward. Even just what, you know, Finn 365 is doing with those recreations, that pushes the ball forward, because it gives, what he's trying to do is do an accurate a job as possible, given what actually happens to people, and recreating it in the CGI space. And he does it, and as far as I know, he's done it all for free. He does it all just as a passion project, and he does it to help people out and to let other people know, like, more realistically what's going on. And I think that's really beautiful. I think that's really beautiful to recognize that we already have, many of us, we already have, all we have to do is think about what skills do we already have. Maybe it involves woodworking. Maybe it involves that telescope that's collecting dust over in the corner, you know, and maybe it's, you know, some software, or, you know, something that you can do on a computer that, that you just have a better than average skill set with, you know, and thinking about these skill sets and really looking at them and saying, like, well, how can I use that to express myself? How can how can I use this to find a more accurate form of this phenomenon and really explore that? I think that when we have headaches within the community in terms of like, oh, why doesn't this happen? Why doesn't somebody do something about this? Why doesn't somebody do something about this? I used to do this myself. I used to think, why isn't there a community online for people to be able to talk about this stuff? Why? And I thought about it for years. I was like, God, and I was so mad at this abstraction that it didn't exist, that there wasn't like a safe place for experiencers to go. And then one day, you know, I finally had the realization that had been staring me in the face for years, is that, you know, like, I have to be part of the solution. You know what I mean? And that is so true for so many people in this community, not just this community, but, you know, this is part of human development. This is part of becoming an adult and recognizing, like, you know, these things that you think need to exist in the world. And instead of getting mad about how somebody else isn't doing it fast enough, maybe recognize that the world's telling you that you get to do it yourself.
Yeah, I'm going to interview Finn Hanley at some point, and he told me as far as I recollect, he told me one of the reasons he wanted to create these animations was to show to the world that a lot of these sightings are stupidly unambiguous. It's not always just some little dot far off in the distance. Sometimes it's like a black triangle with lights you could throw a rock at. And one of the interesting details of one of his sightings, that he's going to make an animation for his own sighting eventually. But one of the interesting details is he said that when he was looking at the triangle, it like went translucent for a few moments, like in a weird, bizarre way, and then went back solid. So the actual details of some of these sightings can be pretty profound. And it's not always just, which I'm not saying that, you know, somewhat ambiguous sightings can't be significant and can't be an observation of the phenomenon itself. I'm just pointing out that sometimes it's completely, utterly, it's as unambiguous as seeing a 747 landing at an airport sometimes.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I think that that's a really important thing to see. I'll say one more aside about that meeting. It was so funny that, okay, so one of the people that was at this table, they're an experiencer, and they also happened to have been on the iPhone design team, like the hardware design team, right? And I posed to this person, I was like, so, you know, that cone of silence that happens in some situations, and it'll even be written about, or there'll just be no sound on one of Finn's videos or something like that. And it's because the person, you know, is eerily quiet. You know, there's this strange cone of silence that happens, and that's kind of common. And I was like, what do you think that it would take to, like, you know, we all, like, a lot, you know, these AirPods, a lot of us, we use things relatively frequently that have noise reduction in them. And I was like, how much do you think it would take to, like, have some, like, meta tagging in there in a video like this, you know, in a YouTube video, to be able to kind of, like, automatically trigger like noise suppression and things like that to make things even quieter? And he sat there and he was like, well, that's a good question. And then and it's like, and then I kind of went back to the conversation, and like 10 minutes later, he was like, I think it'll take about 4 months. And he was like laying out, and he like almost took the question like too seriously. You know what I mean? Where he was like, it'll take about 12 people. Here's the way that they're, you know what I mean? He was charting out like dollar figures, how much it might cost, all this kind of stuff. But like, that's the level of granularity that that we're going to need in the future. And the fact that we can have that, we're reducing stigma within this field just by having these conversations and just being able to show each other even recreation videos like that, and being able to normalize these conversations means that people like that can feel more free to speak on the level and in granular detail about like how like what would be needed more to make things even more accurate and push the ball even more further. And I really love that. I think it's amazing. So, something can start, in a kind of like freeware CGI and end up, leading to like pretty high level conversations. I think that's beautiful.
I have a really wild question to ask you. It's kind of ridiculous, but it's like, why not? Do you perceive am I being naive and irrational when I think that in a post-disclosure world, eventually we could have such intimacy with the phenomenon that people could volunteer to be abducted, in the sense that this phenomenon is hell-bent on doing medical observation, right? Could there ever be a scenario where it would communicate with us and be like, okay, we're here, we're going to hide less. Here's the deal. Because there's a lot of people out there who probably would volunteer for this. I wouldn't, but there probably are a lot of people that would volunteer for this. Could that be something that happens, or does that contradict the literature in that the phenomenon is maybe in a reality that cannot interact with us in such a controlled way? What's your take on something like that?
Well, it's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. But I mean, I think that people can volunteer themselves in different ways, not necessarily for the abduction phenomenon, but there are like what Diana Pasulka talks about as protocols and things like that. People talk about heists, situations like that. People work on meditative states that could kind of engender more experiences with regard to being able to kind of quiet the brain in meditation. That tends to kind of lead to a lot. Within the experiencer group and within the literature and kind of like the private records there, like, meditation practice often leads to anomalous experiences. A lot. And that's important to think about. And so when people talk about, and those experiences tend to be more gentle than the kind of interactions with the grays. So there are ways that people can kind of like make themselves more available if they want to have odd experiences. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen, but it could be. I think that one of the reasons why a lot of people don't have more experiences is because of this thing that everybody carries around in their pocket. They use their phones and they use to filter reality. And these are obviously like the coolest objects that exist in many ways to a lot of people, and for good reason. They give us your wonderful YouTube show. It's right in your pocket. You can do anything on this puppy. You can order coffee. It's great. But you don't tend to have like profound communal experiences with paranormal phenomenon by like logging on to your iPhone. So along with what you're saying, I think that there are ways to volunteer to have more profound experiences in life. But from my perspective, I wouldn't necessarily recommend people trying to volunteer for an abduction experience, because there's a lack of agency. When you're talking about volunteering, maybe I could see that there could be a big pool of people that want for something like that to happen, and at the end of the day, they're going to pick who they want. You know what I mean? I mean, seemingly that's what's going to happen. And so, I think that it's a situation that there would be no guarantees in many, many different ways. That said, like, I think if people want to have, again, more experiences, more profound experiences, there are ways to go about that. And even if they don't work in the way that you intend, they might have positive outcomes anyway.
Yeah. Well, I was mostly framing it in terms of like open contact, to where it wasn't so much like going out into the field and saying abduct me, but like as if a program began where they reached out to our civilization and said, any volunteers? But that's, a little bit wild, and I don't know if that will ever happen. I want to touch on your comment about meditation, because I couldn't agree more. And I know that Dean Radin, he has said this multiple times, that if you want to open yourself up to the paranormal or anomalous experiences, meditation is like the most direct way to do it. I'm a long time meditator. I've had a lot of weird experience, not a lot. I've had a couple weird, but even the experiences that are not necessarily completely outlandish, just like feeling energies in your body that you would never ever feel if you're not meditating, becomes a very routine experience. And I mean, that's kind of a less like jolting paranormal experience, but it's still quite interesting, like feeling your consciousness expand beyond the body, or feeling pressure points in various parts of the body. I had an interesting, back in like 2011, I don't really like talking about it too much because it might compromise my credibility a little bit. And I'm not even claiming that this is paranormal, right? Maybe there's something inside my brain that wants me to think something paranormal is happening. I don't think that's the case, but if someone wants to say that's the most likely, that's fine, because I could absolutely care less. But like in 2011, I think it was, because I've been meditating for a very long time, even back in 2011, I was meditating one evening, and all of a sudden, my torso started going like this in extreme rapid speed. And it wasn't like I couldn't stop it. I could stop it, but it was completely unambiguous that there was some energy flowing through me that was independent of me. And this lasted for like, I think, months. Like every time I would sit down to meditate. And it wasn't even when I would sit down to meditate. I could be like standing in line for a movie, and it would just come out of nowhere. I'd start feeling energy, wanting to like maneuver my body in weird, bizarre ways. And I would like chant things. I would do the most bizarre things you can imagine that would be like, would look like Kundalini yoga, which I've never done. Sure. I don't do. I'm not real interested in. I've done like Iyengar yoga, but not like Kundalini yoga, which is a completely different thing. But like I'd be doing like spontaneously doing like mudras and I'd be screaming at the top of my lungs. Like it was completely and utterly over the top. And I'd even like be speaking in tongues. It was completely bizarre. And I'll be very honest with you. To this day, if I'm just relaxed and I sit down, sometimes my face will want to like move like this sometimes. And it's obvious to me that it's an independent energy. And when it first happened, and my torso was twirling like a crazy madman, I was thinking to myself, am I getting possessed right now? Like that was literally going through my mind. And I want to underscore that I could stop it. Like I could intervene and stop it, but simultaneously, it was extremely unambiguous to me that there's something kind of manipulating me that it's not like I couldn't stop, but like it was clear that I wasn't like, I want to start doing all these things. Like there was no component of that. And so that would be like maybe a little bit over the top of an example of paranormal. I don't know why anyone would want to experience that. I don't understand it. And like I said, to this day, if I'm just sitting around, even when I meditate, I will get subtle movements. And what I'll say is, before this happened, like that one time where it just came out of nowhere, never happened before. Like, and I was meditating years prior to that, never happened before. And then all of a sudden, and it still happens. Doesn't happen like it did, but I still get weird, spontaneous movements that I'm like, I'm so used to it. It's really strange. But yeah, I think, and I got to say this because there are people who say that meditation opens you up to demonic activity. And my experience would just be like perfect for people that want to further that narrative. Oh, see, I told you so. But I would argue that there's depression, depression opens you up to demonic energies. And meditation is known through science. If you look at the brain scans, the parts of the brain that are prone to cause you anxiety and depression kind of decreases, and the parts of the brain known to release happiness chemicals expand. So to anyone who would say like meditation is opening yourself to demons, I'd say, nah, depression opens yourself up to demons. People that are like unhappy or depressed are more likely to hurt other people. They're more likely to say mean things to other people. So I would argue you become more godly the less stress you have. So if you want to tell people don't meditate because I would be like, well, I don't know, if meditation helps them decrease stress, they'll probably be more righteous than if they ignore meditation if it helps them. So that's all I'll say about that.
I think that you brought up some really, really pertinent points there, Ryan, and I appreciate you being honest about that and being open about that, because these are vulnerable topics, but there's a long-standing history of situations like this. When we talk about spontaneous mudras, which is for those that don't know, that's kind of like mudras are often hand gestures that are used in meditation practice to seemingly kind of be conducive to certain energetic states, right? And so when people like pray, you can in some ways think about, when people put their hands together in a form for prayer, in a way that's a mudra, right? In a way that's kind of like a way of focusing towards like what you're trying to do in terms of like being in communication with some higher power, right? So similarly, people have these kinds of mudras using combinations of their fingers and their thumbs in different forms. And there's been a long-standing documented history of people kind of having spontaneous mudra or these kinds of like rocking or kind of like energetic churning and these sensations that happen. There's a lot to that. And there are books like Spiritual Emergency, which again, it's got this queasy title, but it's got a lot to it. That was written by Stanislav Grof and Christina Grof. It was edited by them, and then there are a lot of essayists like Ram Dass in there and Keith Thompson and others, really kind of talking about what happens when people have situations like that, and then they need to figure out like what do they do to process and integrate it into their lives. And like that book itself, Spiritual Emergency, has been really helpful for me in terms of like, how do I read this in a way that's pertinent to how people are experiencing and processing or trying to frame just even ufology or just, these kinds of shoehorned paranormal experiences that actually have kind of a wider historical precedent to them, right? And along the lines of what you're saying, yeah, absolutely. I think that, and to some people, they might think of meditation as being too Eastern mysticism, too this, too that. In a lot of ways, it depends exactly on what kind of meditation you're doing, right? Because as you know, there's like more Zen forms of meditation where you just try to erase all thought from your head. And that can be its own form of concentration that you can utilize in the future so that you just get all of those kinds of like interrupting thoughts out of your head, right? And then there's more focused forms of meditation that really it's more about kind of like honing your brain. So in many ways, like meditation is just learning how to concentrate. It's learning how to like take yourself more seriously. It's like learning how to like take your mind more seriously so that you can think better. I mean, people can just think of it like that. And most of, the really high operating, highly capable individuals in the world, a lot of them, especially inventors and things like that, they have their own form of meditation. They might not call it that, but there's often a form of deep concentration that they have to develop over time to be able to get into a state where they can stumble upon something genius. And, I commend you for talking about it because at the end of the day, it's a form of human development and people shouldn't shy away from that. And I think that you're right that it can absolutely help in terms of like reducing the amount of depression. And, there are other aspects that can keep those dark energies, however you want to think of them, at bay too, like regular sleep and diet. And like, whether you're drinking or like what kind of drugs people take and things like that. There's a lot of ways that people can just, it seems so simple. It seems so simple, but there are clear ways that people often forget or that are inconvenient truths for how they can reduce the amount of negativity in their lives, right? So anyway, I think that there's absolute validity to what you're talking about, and like the works of Robert Monroe are interesting that way. There's a book called Secret Body by Jeff Kripal that talks about this. There's a book called The Multidimensional Human by Kurt Leland that kind of gets at this in terms of what's going on. And what you're talking about, it does kind of get at that more kind of initiatory state where it's almost like an aspect of your brain or your subconscious or some other form of you is trying to kind of shake you up a little bit, shake you up like a snow globe, and for one reason or another. That's speculation. I'm not saying that that's exactly what's happening, but it sure feels like that to a lot of the people that experience it.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I don't know what was behind that even to this day. Maybe from meditating a lot, some synapse in my mind changed and it causes that. Maybe it has a completely and utterly mystical or paranormal explanation. Don't know, don't care. Just saying that I had that experience. I would call that an anomalous experience, regardless of what's causing it. I guess I had this great conversation, by the way. I guess I'll ask you one last question. Late March on that UFO podcast, I'm just going to read the quote. You said, individuals, groups, and factions that have so many kinds of secret plays happening right now toward this year, this spring, this summer, this fall. If any two of these situations go down the way that they are planned, it's going to be a real paradigm shift for the public conversation. And there's the possibility for a lot more wild situations, possibly in DC, possibly in New York, that will be coming up. I think that 2023, no BS, I kind of hate it when people talk like this, but I really think that this is going to be the biggest paradigm shift year since 2017 for this field. You were correct. You were right. Kudos to you. Or thanks. I don't really like that word, kudos, but congratulations to you. Give us a forecast. Give us a disclosure forecast. Anything else you see coming down the pipe that we can get excited about?
Well, I mean, I appreciate that, and thanks. And it wasn't a crystal ball. It was just being like a Forrest Gump like adult that happens to be around a bunch of brilliant people a lot of the time. But I do think that 2024. I think this has been an amazing year. I mean, look at what happened in terms of the public conversation. It's hard to keep up with how many articles and news pieces and segments and situations like this, like the Soul Foundation gathering, right? Like how many situations like that are happening these days. And the conversation has progressed markedly this year. I'm thrilled that it has. And some things did get kind of blocked or kind of delayed and things like that. And so, but at the same time, we got so much this year. And from all that I've heard, next year is going to be even bigger in this regard. Absolutely. I mean, a lot of what's been happening in 2023, it's only setting the stage for what's going to be happening in 2024. So, and it, for those that have eyes to see, it's pretty clear that, you look at what people are deliberating, what people are talking about, and to talk about other whistleblowers and how is that going to happen. And you look at plays like this week in terms of maybe the Schumer is going to get shut down, and then magically, the OGA is outed for the first time, right? And other situations like that. And, there are other, there was an interesting kind of statement earlier today that Mark was pointed out. He writes for The Hill, and he was pointing out a pretty interesting guess about where that $22 million, what that actually did back in the day. And it's important to recognize that going into 2024, it's going to be interesting to see new players and also recontextualization for people that have been in this community, that have been around, that you've known about, and then realizing, oh, that's what they were doing. That's what they were doing. some of these players, like, you'd be surprised about some of these people that are hiding in plain sight. They're right there. They're right there in front of you. And I don't pretend to know all of them, but like I've been amazed at what I've seen that way. And, again, these are people's lives and things like that. So I like, as much as I don't want to play the, like, I know something you don't game, but it's not like in many situations, it would be wrong for somebody to like out one of their relatives at the Thanksgiving table, right? To be like, cousin so-and-so, whatever kind of inconvenient aspect, whether it's their sexuality, whether it's something that they really like, whatever's embarrassing. But what if it was something that was actually dangerous? What if it was something that actually had like larger implications? There are situations like that happen. And so it'll be interesting to see new people come out of the woodwork. It'll be interesting to hear new voices, people that are allowed to say things that they haven't been able to say before from different fields. And it'll be interesting also to have kind of a new contextualization in ways that are positive and ways that are like really exciting, and maybe even sometimes ways that I don't feel so great in terms of like people that have been right around us like this whole entire time.
So I'm just going to add one more question, because this is something that I've been focusing on for a while now. We've had a couple hearings now. We had Ronald Moultrie, Scott Bray with the Navy, Ronald Moultrie with like the Department of Defense. I forget their titles, but they're way up there, and they've downplayed the phenomenon. Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, head of Aero, downplayed the phenomenon, and on the other hand, we've had witnesses like David Grush, Ryan Graves, Commander Fravor, former CIA directors, John Brennan, former directors of national intelligence, John Ratcliffe. Then we have people like who was like the manager of OSAP, James Lukatsky, Colin Kelleher, I think, was also kind of like a manager. We have Dr. Eric Davis. He's had a security clearance forever. I think he's working for Aerospace Corporation now, which is kind of tethered to the Pentagon. My point is, for the longest time, for a very long time now, and I think it's only going to so all these people that know are saying, yeah, UFOs are non-human intelligence. The United States government has recovered non-human craft and biologics. So that's one part of the picture we're seeing now. The other part is the officialdom of the Department of Defense denying. And yet recently we had Lou Elizondo tweet out that a lot of work has been going on behind the scenes in the beginning, if not middle of next year, 2024. Those efforts are going to emerge. How is the U.S. government going to navigate these hearings, these whistleblowers saying one thing, while the U.S. government is just wants to lie to the public still? Like, at some point, doesn't the U.S. government have to like wave the white flag and say, yeah, we're full of BS and we apologize? How long can this go on where all these people with incredibly high clearances, they were trusted with the most intimate secrets of the national security apparatus, and they're like, they want to tell the public the truth, but then the national security state, if you will, wants to tell us something else? How long can this contradiction persist?
I don't think it can persist for much longer. I think that it's crazy making. Holding two truths in one's head, and knowing that one of them is not accurate. These kinds of it causes a form of manic energy that you can see, within this field, and not just the people that participate and watch it, but in situations like Moultrie and Bray's hearing, you can practically feel the stilted, kind of hostile, aggressive energy in a situation like that. And you're just like, come on, watching Sean Kirkpatrick, sit in his recliner, the other day, or, sitting there in front of Gillibrand, and he's like rolling his eyes, and it doesn't feel great listening to people like that talk. I mean, I'll just say that on a basic level. It's just like, and we all think that we have the best BS detectors in the world. Every person thinks that some people don't. Some people are like, oh, anybody could lie to me. But especially within people that follow this field, we like to think that we've got good BS detectors. But it doesn't take a particularly good BS detector when you're watching somebody like Sean Kirkpatrick. You just don't. You don't need it at all. And I don't think that it's going to take. I don't think that we have a long time to wait in terms of that shoe dropping, because even what we see this week in terms of the gamesmanship, in terms of the reveals, there's that. There's Luna and Burchett and the kind of the House UAP group are talking about doing a press conference tomorrow morning, 11 to 12. Yeah, the OGA, like a bunch of shoes have been dropping lately, and there's a lot happening just right now with regard to the Schumer, and it's important to recognize that that in and of itself, it's like trying to put your thumb on a dam, right? And there's this 9-person review board, and like there's all these, there's the system that they're going to try to put in place, and there's this kind of idea that that's going to be it, that's going to be the conduit that we're going to listen to things from. And like the thing is, though, is that we still have our agency because we're human beings. We still have our agency to be able to pursue this ourselves as well. So even when that does or does not pass, that's not the end of the story. That's not the only source of news that we're going to hear from. And in these other situations, we still have our free wills. We still have our agency. Never a straight answer. Yes, absolutely. Right. NASA, they haven't been perfectly honest with us. They haven't. I was just, Kelly and I were literally interviewing a space psychologist that works with people after they come back with their traumatic experiences from what happens up there. NASA's been lying to us, right? A lot of these programs have been lying to us. Moultrie and Bray, that didn't seem honest. People, again, leaning on the Soul thing, like the Soul Foundation, I didn't hear a single person speaking about Arrow with any kind of sense of respect or seriousness. It wasn't even a factor. Now, if you thought that was like a legitimate situation, don't you think that somebody would have brought it up in a more serious manner? They didn't. Nobody did, because it's not. It's just PR. It's like a public-facing element, and I'm glad that it's been basically outed as such. I mean, that's my personal opinion, and like I don't pretend to be like some like I can see everything in the world, but I don't think you have to see much to understand that that the people, that there's a reason probably why Sean Kirkpatrick, got his plum gig over at Oak Ridge or whatever, right? That it's like, okay, you did your year, now come and hide while the truth comes out. You know what I mean? And I think that he knew. I would presume, if I'm going to presume to know anything, it's that when I saw that guy's eyes in those hearings and the times that he's come out and talked, that he knows that the time with which people are going to treat him with respect, that it's a period of days, it's a period of weeks, it's a period of months, but it's not a period of years, and for good reason. The guy was paid to lie to the American public, and by extension, he was paid to lie to the world. And I don't think that's right. And we'll be hearing more about that. So, in answer to your question, yeah, it's I don't think that we have a long time to wait before more shoes are going to drop.
Yeah, I mean, because it's like, the UFO reports are so ridiculous. It could be a glitch in the radar. It appears this, it appears that. Meanwhile, if you actually have artifacts from another civilization and biologics, and you have systems that can track UAP, and you're shooting at them, hoping they come down so you can actually retrieve them, and then sometimes they land and you have operations to. It's just, it's got to be embarrassing for the U.S. government. And I just feel like you don't diminish embarrassment by keeping the charade going as long as you possibly can. You diminish embarrassment by being like, okay, we need to fess up that this is kind of not the truth, and here's kind of what the truth is.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. Yeah, and I look forward to more coming out, and I look forward to more grassroots efforts, more initiatives from within our community and from kind of like the wider community as more specialization comes into this field, as more professionals begin to like kind of like open up with new eyes and say, oh, wow, this has been real the whole time. I think that we're going to see a lot of advancement, not just in Capitol Hill, which is famously slow, and even goes backwards against what the cultural norms time and time again. We're going to see more, and we're going to see more from unique people, from new folks, and I applaud those efforts. I think we all should really encourage more kind of like independent initiatives, grassroots efforts, more situations like that, because that it does put more pressure on in general. And we can find unique truths that maybe they weren't even looking for. There's that old saying that like when you're a hammer, all you see is nails, right? And so along those lines, there are probably many aspects of anomalous experiences and the phenomenon that Capitol Hill, that the Pentagon, and that these agencies have never even really looked at, because that wasn't their concern. It wasn't their concern. So we need more unique eyeballs on this situation, and we're going to have them. We already do, and there's going to be more papers coming out, more people that have been kind of hiding and quietly doing their work that are going to be publishing, that are going to be talking more publicly, and I think we have a lot more to look forward to in the days and months ahead, for sure. Can I mention one thing?
100%. Go for it.
Along the lines of grassroots efforts, not to be corny, but like here in a week and a half, our good mutual friend James Ian Doley and I and Leslie Kane, of course, the New York Times journalist, and she's recently been writing for the Debrief. We're doing this conference in New York City, right, on December 9th, and Diana Pasulka is going to be speaking at it. We actually have three folks that were speakers at the Soul Foundation. There's Diana, Peter Skafish, who's the director of research for the Soul Foundation, and we've got Tim Gallaudet that's going to be there. And Tim's great. I met his mom, by the way, in Palo Alto. She's like a real sweetheart. It was really cool to meet her. At that conference, we're also going to hear from Mike Masters. We're going to hear from Joshua Cutchin, who I was talking about a little bit earlier. But I've got one piece of exclusive news for you that I thought you'd enjoy. It's that we like, James and I and Leslie, we'd like to have like a secret surprise for folks. We like to kind of under promise and over deliver with these situations. So I'm happy to announce through your podcast, if you're all right with it,
absolutely,
that we have a surprise speaker, and that speaker is Alex Dietrich. I'm really psyched that Alex Dietrich is going to be coming out. She's super psyched about it. I was talking to her just yesterday about this, and she's going to be doing a fireside chat with Leslie.
That's great.
Conference that day. And I'm really excited about it. We hung out in Palo Alto. I got along great. It was the first time I'd met her, and boy, she's a real pleasure. So I'm really excited that Alex is going to be kind of speaking. And we were talking about it, and we were like, gosh, it'd be really fun to like hear from Alex Dietrich and like not even mention the Tic Tac. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if Alex Dietrich had a conversation and we didn't even go over the Tic Tac incident one more time? That would be so cool, wouldn't it? So we'll look forward to seeing like what exactly Alex has to say that day.
Well, I'll link to your upcoming event with Alex Dietrich and other people in the description below.
Well, thanks, man. Appreciate it. Did you have any last remarks?
Yeah, I did. You did.
Sure.
And by the way, I've watched your earlier events and I've enjoyed them thoroughly, and I'm looking forward to your next one as well. I learn a lot every time.
Thanks, man.
Carl Nell is worried about catastrophic disclosure. One of the components of catastrophic disclosure is if a foreign government, China, Russia, like you said, the Chinese people, the Russian people are beautiful, but the American government sees it as like a competition, if you will. Do you think it's how likely do you think it is that, you know, China and Russia could see the writing on the wall? They're like, well, we don't want the United States to be able to have the overwhelming influence of being the disclosure nation, so we're just going to beat them to it. What do you think the likelihood of something like that occurring is?
I think it's very possible. I mean, I think that's yet another reason why, you know, we see this, why we see the alarm clock going off with regard to public initiatives, especially from the governmental and military perspective. I think that it's not just grassroots efforts. It's not just like prosumer gear. It's not just that stuff, but it's not just the academia. It's not just the startups, but there is an element of that. I mean, like, look, we're in a proxy war. Like, the U.S. military, not us, not Ryan, not me. I'm a pacifist, but like, you know, the U.S. military is in a proxy war with Russia right now. Right? Like, where does Ukraine get all those weapons, right? Where do they get funding from? You know, and, you know, there's also a proxy war that's happening in Israel right now. I mean, we're in a really precarious place with the world powers that be, and everybody is, you know, and I think that that's one aspect that, like, we often just don't want to listen to. And I try to be as kind of like bipartisan as possible, but it doesn't take partisanship to recognize the precariousness of where we are as a world these days. And along those lines, I could see there being like a huge strategic advantage to another world power disclosing things that are incredibly inconvenient, or trying to take some kind of like to win some kind of public opinion towards their way by actually being honest about this stuff. I think that it's incredibly possible. And like, I think that people, you know, I think that folks in power in the US government and elsewhere, you know, really should be concerned about. And I think that they are. And I'm glad that Carl Nell brought that up, because, you know, it is a likelihood. It's not the first time that I've heard that. And to me, it's kind of like, well, whatever hastens this in terms of like getting some of the basics and fundamentals out there to the people is great, you know. And so if they're scared of China in this situation because they think China might like come out and be honest about this stuff, great, good, be scared, like be a little scared, be really scared, get the information out there, you know. And like, I understand the inclination from some, you know, like, we have to do this in a responsible way, but get the fundamentals out there. Like, we could be operating on a much higher level as a culture if we just had some of the basics out there as like as accepted truths. And I see that imminent. Absolutely.
Yeah, and like all these whistleblowers, we're going to probably get more whistleblowers. We may get more insiders coming forward. And it's like, at a certain point, you don't have to be like deep into the UFO topic. Every day, Joes are going to be like, okay, the government's lying. Why are all these insiders saying one thing, but the government in its official capacity is saying another? At some point, that becomes a catastrophic disclosure. We don't want that.
That's right. Yeah, we don't. I mean, like, you know, and it's tough because we find ourselves in this kind of like this odd, you know, prison experiment where we really want our jailers, you know, we want to give them the benefit of the doubt over and over and over again. We give them so much room, where we give them so much rope, and then they hang themselves over and over and over with this situation. And like, I do see it coming to head. I think it's going to be, I see a path forward. I see light at the end of the tunnel, more than that. And it's also, it's okay. I think one important thing here is that we have within ufology this kind of like part of the manic energy is that, you know, we've been lied to for so long. These secrets have been kept. And then also we've been looking at this situation, the framing that we've been looking at ufology from has been primarily through like a military bias, where it's like we take pilot situations more seriously. Like, I think Alex is awesome. I'm glad that people took her case seriously with David Fravor and others. But there's so many other people out there, right? And the fact that ufology has been kind of like owned in some ways and framed from a military framework with military eyes has been an incredible disservice in many ways to the cultural conversation. Because first of all, there are so many people that are interested in paranormal topics that are really bummed out by war, and they're really bummed out by the military, and they're really bummed out by Washington, D.C. And I think that that's by design. I think ufology has been trained like a dog to look at this field through military eyes, and I don't think that that's necessarily always the best framework to be doing this. So, in the days ahead, I'm looking forward to people being able to take a broader framework and really take advantage of this situation. So there's plenty of reason to be a little bit worried if I were the powers that be, for sure.
All right, so let's wrap this up. I'll give you the floor to say anything you need, even what's your favorite soft drink, doesn't matter. Just go ahead and say what you got to say to the world. All right. This isn't your last meal, but it is your last statement on this show. Go for it.
Okay, well, I mean, I will say happy holidays to everybody out there. And that I really appreciate knowing Ryan. It's been, I think, Ryan, you do such great work.
Thank you.
And you do a wonderful job with the conversation. And I think that you giving voice to the frustration and taking the tone that you do, and the way that you're able to bring humor and prescience and a measured amount of enthusiasm, a measured amount of indignation. You bring a lot of measured, energy to the field in many different respects, and I think that you do it in a wonderful, wonderful way. So I'm thrilled and honored that you had me on the program today, and I look forward to more conversations, both in private and in public, with you in the months and years ahead. Awesome. I think the community is really, you're a blessing to the community. Absolutely. And you don't even need the robes to have that.
Oh man, that's another subject. I look back at some of my old stuff and I'm like, what were you thinking? Are you crazy? Like, you have no shame. All right. Well, with that, I'll wrap it up, and God bless. Please do not forget to subscribe. And if you'd like to support this channel, you can check out my merch shop where I sell t-shirts. You could become a patron. You could become a YouTube member. You could give me a one-time donation. All those possibilities can be accessed in the description box below. Or you could just slap a like on this bad boy and I'll appreciate it so much. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Special thanks to all patrons, YouTube members, those that have bought merch, those that have given me a one-time donation. I couldn't do without you. Thank you so much. See you in the next episode.